The hardest choices are the ones nobody will ever know you made. The zipper rasped through the empty bus shelter just as the rain began to fall harder across Colfax Avenue. Emma Carter stared at the black leather messenger bag resting beneath the cold metal bench where she had been waiting for the number 15 bus. She glanced around. The shelter was empty except for the distant sound of tires hissing across wet pavement and the blinking amber traffic signal at the intersection. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the bag onto her lap. It felt heavier than it should have. Slowly, she pulled the zipper open. 5 perfectly stacked bundles of $100 bills filled the inside. $50,000. Her breath caught in her throat. She counted once. Then again. Still $50,000. Tucked beside the cash were business documents, a locked smartphone vibrating every few seconds, and a leather card holder with no visible identification. The phone buzzed again. A message appeared across the locked screen. Do not take the bag to the police. Emma froze. A cold wave rolled through her chest stronger than the November wind, pushing rain beneath the shelter roof. She slipped the phone back inside without answering. $50,000. More money than she had ever seen in one place. Enough to erase every overdue notice folded inside the kitchen drawer back home. Enough to pay nearly a year's rent on her tiny apartment. Enough to replace Sophie's worn winter boots that leaked every time it rained. Enough to finally fix the old sedan she could no longer afford to repair before selling it months ago. Enough to breathe again. She closed the bag and pressed both hands against it while the rain drummed harder overhead. In her coat pocket rested another envelope. She already knew every word without opening it. Final notice. Payment required within 72 hours. Failure to pay would begin the eviction process. She closed her eyes for only a second. Sophie's smiling face appeared immediately. Her daughter had asked the night before whether they could still decorate cookies together for Christmas even if they couldn't buy a tree. Emma had smiled and promised they would. Figure something out. She always made promises. She simply had no idea how to keep this one. The phone vibrated again. The same warning flashed across the screen before disappearing. Emma looked toward the empty street. Whoever owned the bag might already be searching. Whoever sent the message clearly did not want the police involved. That thought settled something inside her. She stood, tightened her worn navy coat against the wind, and stepped into the rain carrying the bag close to her chest. Each block toward the police station felt heavier than the last. Every passing storefront reflected the same exhausted woman with wet blonde hair, soaked shoes, and a future balanced on one impossible decision. Inside the station, warm fluorescent lights replaced the gray afternoon. A young officer looked up as Emma carefully placed the leather bag on the counter. I found this at the bus stop, she said quietly. I think someone is looking for it. Minutes later, officers confirmed the amount inside without revealing details. They thanked her repeatedly and asked for her contact information in case the owner wished to reward her. Emma shook her head with a gentle smile. If someone lost that much money, she replied, they've already had a bad enough day. Just make sure it gets back to them. She signed only the required report and quietly walked back outside before anyone could change her mind. Across the street, parked beside a sleek black SUV, Daniel Brooks lowered the file he had been reading after watching the entire exchange through rain-speckled glass. He had recognized the messenger bag immediately. He also knew exactly how much money had been inside. As Emma disappeared toward the bus stop with empty hands and an eviction notice still hidden inside her pocket, Daniel never asked his driver to start the engine. Instead, he quietly said 4 words that would change both of their lives. Stay here. Don't move yet. Daniel Brooks continued watching through the rain-speckled windshield long after Emma disappeared toward the bus stop. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror, waiting for the usual instruction to return to Walker Capital before the afternoon board meeting. Instead, Daniel remained silent, his eyes fixed on the sidewalk where the young woman had vanished into the steady November rain carrying nothing except a worn grocery tote and the same quiet dignity she had carried into the police station. Finally, he spoke without looking away. Find out whether the owner recovered the bag. The answer came less than 10 minutes later through his executive assistant. The messenger bag belonged to one of Walker Capital's investment partners who had accidentally left it behind after a private meeting downtown. Every dollar was accounted for. Every document was still inside. The partner had already offered a substantial reward to the woman who returned it. Daniel looked up immediately. Did she accept it? His assistant hesitated before answering. No, sir. She declined to leave any contact information beyond what was legally required for the police report. Daniel slowly leaned back against the leather seat. That made even less sense. He had spent 2 decades building companies, negotiating billion-dollar transactions, and studying human behavior inside boardrooms where every decision carried a price. He had met generous people, ambitious people, brilliant people, and dishonest people. But he had almost never met someone who walked away from $50,000 when nobody could have blamed them for making a different choice. Outside, the rain softened into a mist as pedestrians hurried home beneath umbrellas. Daniel watched buses arrive and leave until he finally spotted Emma climbing aboard with tired shoulders and damp blonde hair. Keep your distance, he quietly told his driver. Do not let her notice us. The black sport utility vehicle followed several cars behind as the city slowly changed around them. Glass office towers gave way to older brick buildings. Busy shopping districts faded into neighborhoods where sidewalks were cracked and porch lights flickered on before sunset. Emma stepped off the bus carrying 2 grocery bags and walked another 6 blocks without complaint, stopping only once to help an elderly man whose reusable shopping bag had split open across the sidewalk. She knelt without hesitation, gathering canned vegetables and oranges that had rolled into the gutter while the man repeatedly thanked her. She smiled, wished him a safe evening, and continued home as though kindness required no recognition at all. Daniel watched everything without saying a word. The vehicle stopped half a block away from a small apartment building where faded paint peeled from the railings and one hallway window had been covered with cardboard instead of glass. Before Emma reached the entrance, the front door flew open. A little girl with golden hair raced down the steps, wearing rain boots that were clearly one size too small. Mom! Sophie threw her arms around Emma's waist so tightly that the grocery bags nearly slipped from her hands. Emma laughed softly, kissed the top of her daughter's head, and together they disappeared inside. Several minutes later, a kitchen light flickered on behind a second-floor window. Daniel remained parked where he was, unable to explain why he could not leave. Through the thin curtains, he saw only ordinary moments. Emma unpacked groceries onto a tiny counter. Sophie sat at a small table coloring with short crayons while talking excitedly about school. When dinner was ready, Emma placed a full bowl in front of her daughter and a much smaller portion in front of herself. Then, after Sophie looked away, Emma quietly slid most of her own food into the child's bowl and smiled as though she had already eaten earlier. Daniel lowered his eyes. The image stayed with him far longer than the stacks of cash ever had. At that moment, he realized the woman who had returned $50,000 had done so, knowing exactly what that money could have meant inside that little apartment. And for the first time in many years, a question entered his mind that no financial report had ever been able to answer. What kind of strength allows someone with almost nothing to walk away from everything they desperately need? The next morning arrived with a pale winter sun stretching across the rooftops of Denver. But Daniel Brooks found himself paying far less attention to the quarterly earnings report displayed on the conference room screen than to the memory of a small apartment where a mother had quietly given her dinner to her daughter. The presentation continued around him as executives discussed investments, acquisitions, and projected growth, yet every impressive number seemed strangely hollow. When the meeting ended, he closed his tablet and turned toward his executive assistant. I want a full background report on Emma Carter, he said calmly. Nothing intrusive, only public information. I am not interested in her private life. I only want to understand who she is. By late afternoon, the report was surprisingly brief. Emma worked part-time at a neighborhood diner 6 days a week. She volunteered several afternoons each week at Cedar Ridge Community Center without receiving any pay. She had no criminal record, no lawsuits, no financial fraud, no unusual debts beyond ordinary overdue rent and medical expenses, and no social media presence filled with requests for sympathy. There was almost nothing remarkable on paper. Daniel frowned. Sometimes the most extraordinary people left the fewest traces behind. That evening, after finishing work, he asked his driver to take a different route home. The vehicle passed Cedar Ridge Community Center just as volunteers were carrying donated food inside. Through the front windows, Daniel recognized Emma immediately. She wore a simple blue sweater beneath her inexpensive winter coat, her blonde hair tied back as she carefully sorted canned goods onto metal shelves. An elderly woman struggled to lift a heavy box near the entrance before Emma hurried over with an easy smile. She carried the box without hesitation, listened patiently while the woman spoke, then laughed softly at something the older woman said. There were no cameras, no reporters, no wealthy donors touring the building. Nobody seemed to notice what Emma was doing because, to everyone there, it was simply another ordinary afternoon. Daniel remained seated inside the vehicle for several quiet minutes before asking the driver to continue. 2 days later, he saw her again by complete coincidence outside a neighborhood grocery store. A cashier rushed outside after accidentally giving Emma $12 too much in change. Before the employee could even apologize, Emma was already walking back toward the entrance with the bills folded neatly in her hand. "You gave me too much," she said with the same gentle smile before returning every dollar. The cashier thanked her repeatedly while Emma simply wished everyone a pleasant evening and left carrying 2 reusable bags. Daniel watched from across the parking lot, almost expecting someone to reveal that the moment had been staged. It was not. The following Saturday morning, he spotted her once more while driving Max to a nearby veterinary appointment. A teenage girl stood outside a bus stop shivering beneath a thin sweatshirt as icy wind swept through the street. Without drawing attention to herself, Emma removed the knitted scarf from around her own neck and wrapped it gently around the girl's shoulders before continuing on her way. She never asked the girl's name. She never looked back to see whether anyone had noticed. Daniel rested both hands on the steering wheel, feeling something unfamiliar settle quietly inside him. Returning $50,000 had not been a single remarkable decision made under unusual circumstances. It had been one more thread in a pattern woven through every ordinary day of Emma Carter's life. She did not choose honesty because someone was watching. She chose it because it had become part of who she was long before anyone learned her name. As Max quietly rested his head against Daniel's arm, Daniel stared through the windshield and realized that for the first time in years, success no longer looked like the tallest building in the skyline. It looked like a woman walking home with almost nothing, still finding ways to leave everyone she met just a little better than she found them. Monday morning brought clear blue skies above downtown Denver as Walker Capital prepared for its quarterly leadership meeting. But Daniel Brooks found himself thinking less about profit margins than about the quiet woman whose choices had continued to challenge everything he believed about success. When the meeting reached the final agenda item, he closed the financial presentation and looked around the conference table. "Our community outreach program is underperforming," he said evenly. "We invest millions every year, yet we continue designing solutions without listening to the people we claim to serve." Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Richard Coleman, the company's chief financial officer, folded his hands. "We have experienced consultants for that," he replied. Daniel slowly shook his head. "Consultants understand reports. I want someone who understands families." He proposed creating a new position called Community Partnership Coordinator, someone responsible for building genuine relationships with neighborhoods instead of simply managing donations. Richard studied him carefully before asking the question everyone else seemed reluctant to voice. "Is this position based on business needs, or is it based on the woman who returned the money?" The room became completely silent. Daniel answered without hesitation. "If she applies, she will receive exactly the same opportunity as every other applicant. No favors, no shortcuts, no special treatment. I want the best person for the job, and I will not interfere with the hiring process." Later that afternoon, the Human Resources Department officially published the opening across local employment websites and nonprofit networks. Nearly 20 miles away, Emma Carter finished organizing donated groceries at Cedar Ridge Community Center when the volunteer coordinator handed her a printed flyer. "You should look at this," the older woman said with an encouraging smile. "It sounds exactly like the work you already do." Emma glanced at the description. Walker Capital was seeking someone with experience connecting businesses and local communities, coordinating neighborhood programs, and building trust with families. Her hopeful expression faded almost immediately when she reached the preferred qualifications: college degree, corporate communication experience, project management background. She quietly folded the paper. "They are looking for someone much more qualified than I am." The volunteer coordinator gently touched her shoulder. "They are looking for someone who understands people. You have been doing that for years." That evening, after returning to the apartment, Emma spread the flyer across the small kitchen table beside unpaid utility bills and Sophie's homework assignment. She stared at the application requirements while stirring tomato soup on the stove. "What is that?" Sophie asked, climbing onto a chair beside her. Emma smiled softly. "A job that would help a lot of families, but I do not think they would choose someone like me." Sophie studied the paper with the complete confidence only a child could possess. "You always tell me that doing the right thing matters even when it is scary," she said. "Maybe applying is your scary thing." Emma laughed quietly, surprised by the wisdom hidden inside such a simple sentence. After Sophie went to bed, she opened her aging laptop, carefully typed every answer herself, listed her years of volunteer work instead of impressive corporate titles, and described the family she had helped rather than achievements she could not honestly claim. She read the application 3 times before taking a deep breath and pressing the submit button. Across the city, Daniel reviewed the first group of applicants without opening a single resume, honoring the promise he had made to himself. He wanted the hiring committee to make its decision fairly. 3 days later, as hundreds of applications were sorted through the company's screening system, one name quietly advanced into the interview list on merit alone. Emma Carter had earned her place without anyone knowing that the man who could have changed the outcome had deliberately chosen not to. Snow flurries drifted lazily across downtown Denver on the morning of Emma Carter's interview, settling lightly on the polished sidewalks outside Walker Capital's headquarters. She stood quietly across the street for a moment, smoothing the sleeves of the navy blazer she had purchased from a neighborhood thrift store 3 years earlier. It was carefully pressed, but the fabric had begun to show its age around the cuffs. She took one slow breath before crossing toward the revolving glass doors, reminding herself that she had not come to impress anyone. She had come to tell the truth about the people. She knew better than any resume ever could. Inside the soaring marble lobby, warm sunlight poured through enormous windows, reflecting across polished stone floors and brushed steel columns. Everything felt impossibly clean and expensive, yet every employee who greeted her did so with quiet professionalism rather than intimidation. After checking in with reception, Emma accepted a visitor badge and followed a recruiter toward the interview suite. She noticed framed photographs showing neighborhood projects, scholarship programs, and community gardens funded by Walker Capital. Instead of making her nervous, they reminded her why she had applied in the first place. Several minutes later, she entered a bright conference room where 3 interviewers welcomed her with genuine smiles. Daniel Brooks observed silently from another room through a private video feed with the monitor muted. He had insisted on remaining completely absent from the hiring process, determined that Emma's opportunity would belong entirely to her own abilities. Richard Coleman sat among the interview panel with 2 senior community development managers. The questions began simply. Emma described her experience helping families locate food assistance, organizing neighborhood volunteers, and listening before offering solutions. She admitted she had never managed a corporate budget or supervised a large professional staff. Then she quietly added, "People usually know what they need. Sometimes they only need someone willing to believe them." The room became noticeably quieter. One interviewer asked how she would respond if funding was limited and every request could not be approved. Emma paused thoughtfully before answering. "I would tell people the truth. False hope disappears quickly. Honest conversations build trust that lasts much longer." Richard leaned forward. "Suppose you had to choose between following policy and helping a struggling family. Which matters more?" Emma looked directly at him without hesitation. "Good policies should protect people, not ignore them. If a policy hurts families, I would work to improve the policy. But I would never hide information or break the rules because trust is much harder to rebuild than paperwork." Daniel slowly lowered the pen he had been holding. Those words sounded remarkably similar to the decision she had made at the police station weeks earlier. She did not separate compassion from integrity. She believed they belonged together. Nearly an hour later, the interview concluded with warm handshakes and sincere thanks. Emma stepped back into the lobby feeling relieved simply to have spoken honestly. She expected nothing more. As she walked toward the entrance, a familiar golden retriever trotted happily across the marble floor with its leash loosely held by a tall man wearing a charcoal overcoat. Max immediately wagged his tail and stopped in front of Emma, looking up with friendly curiosity. She smiled and gently scratched behind his ears. "Well, hello there, handsome." Daniel approached with an apologetic smile. "I hope he is not bothering you." Emma looked up, recognizing him as the businessman she had briefly noticed outside the police station weeks earlier, though she could not remember where she had seen him. "Not at all," she replied. "He has excellent manners." Daniel introduced himself only as Daniel and thanked her for being kind to his dog. Their conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, touching only on the snowy weather and how much Max enjoyed meeting people. Neither mentioned Walker Capital, the interview, or the bag of money. As Emma stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, she felt unexpectedly lighter than when she had arrived. Behind the lobby windows, Daniel watched her walk away with the same quiet confidence she had carried every single day since he first saw her, and he realized that no interview score could fully measure the kind of character that had already begun changing his own life. 3 days passed before Emma Carter's phone rang while she was wiping down tables at the neighborhood diner during the quiet afternoon between lunch and dinner. She stepped into the small hallway beside the kitchen before answering, expecting another reminder about overdue rent. Instead, a warm voice from Walker Capital introduced herself from the Human Resources Department. Emma listened. Without speaking, her eyes slowly filling with tears she had not expected. She had been selected for the position of Community Partnership Coordinator. The offer had been made unanimously by the interview panel based entirely on her interview performance and years of community service. She thanked the caller several times before ending the conversation and leaning quietly against the wall. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might finally look different from yesterday. That evening, she picked Sophie up from school with a smile her daughter noticed immediately. "Something good happened," Sophie whispered before Emma even said a word. Emma laughed softly and nodded. "Something wonderful happened." They celebrated with 2 cups of hot chocolate from a small neighborhood cafe instead of cooking dinner at home, treating the occasion as though it were the biggest holiday of the year. Across the street, Daniel Brooks happened to be walking Max after leaving an early meeting nearby. The golden retriever immediately recognized Sophie from their brief encounter at Walker Capital and happily trotted toward the little girl with his tail wagging so enthusiastically that Sophie burst into laughter. Daniel apologized with an easy smile, but Emma assured him that Max was welcome. They stood together beneath the fading winter sunlight, while Sophie gently hugged the friendly dog. Daniel noticed the happiness shining across Emma's face. "You look like someone who received good news," he said. Emma smiled with quiet pride. "I accepted a new job today." Daniel extended his hand sincerely. "Congratulations. Whoever hired you made a very wise decision." Emma thanked him without realizing she was speaking to the person who had insisted that she receive no special treatment at all. Dark clouds slowly gathered above the neighborhood, and within minutes a gentle rain began falling across the sidewalk. Daniel opened a large umbrella and offered to drive Emma and Sophie home before the weather became worse. Emma hesitated for only a moment before accepting, grateful for Sophie's sake more than her own. During the short drive, their conversation remained light and comfortable. They spoke about Max's favorite walking trails, Sophie's love of science class, and the best places in Denver to watch the first snowfall each winter. Daniel never mentioned Walker Capital or the interview. Emma never asked what kind of work he did beyond assuming he held an important business position. When they arrived outside the apartment building, Emma thanked him for the ride and wished him a pleasant evening. Sophie hugged Max one last time before running toward the entrance. Daniel watched the little girl disappear up the stairs with the carefree excitement every child deserved. As Emma reached into her coat pocket for her apartment keys, another email notification appeared on her phone. It contained the official employment agreement along with a welcome letter signed by the executive leadership team. She read the first line twice before smiling to herself. The words confirmed what she had almost been afraid to believe. She had earned this opportunity through her own character, her own experience, and her own voice. Sitting quietly inside the parked vehicle after Emma disappeared into the building, Daniel looked up at the warm kitchen light glowing through the second-floor window. Weeks earlier, he had watched that same window while wondering why a struggling mother would walk away from $50,000. Now he understood that her greatest wealth had never been hidden inside a leather bag. It had always been the quiet integrity she carried with her every single day. and he knew the company he had spent years building was about to learn far more from Emma Carter than she would ever learn from him. Emma Carter settled into her new role at Walker Capital with the same quiet determination she had brought to every corner of her life. Instead of spending her first weeks inside executive offices, she visited neighborhood food banks, community centers, public libraries, and small churches where local families gathered. She listened far more than she spoke, carrying a notebook filled with handwritten observations rather than polished presentations. Parents spoke about the lack of affordable childcare. Elderly residents worried about transportation to medical appointments. Teenagers asked for safe places to study after school. Emma returned to headquarters each evening with practical ideas shaped by real conversations instead of assumptions. Her reports were simple, honest, and remarkably effective. Within a month, attendance at Walker Capital's community programs began to rise, and local organizations that had once ignored corporate outreach started requesting partnerships. Daniel Brooks reviewed each report with growing admiration. Emma never exaggerated success or minimized problems. If something failed, she explained why. If something worked, she always credited volunteers before mentioning herself. One afternoon, while reviewing budget documents for an upcoming neighborhood resource fair, Emma noticed a small inconsistency between two financial reports. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary clerical error, but after carefully comparing invoices and transfer records, she realized that nearly $100,000 had accidentally been assigned to the community outreach budget instead of another department. She checked every figure twice before quietly walking down the hallway toward the finance office. Richard Coleman looked up from his desk as she placed the paperwork in front of him. He adjusted his glasses and examined the numbers carefully. After several silent moments, he leaned back in his chair. Very few people would have noticed this, he admitted. Emma nodded. That is exactly why I wanted to report it immediately. Richard folded his hands thoughtfully. The resource fair begins in less than 2 weeks. Correcting this now could delay funding approvals and create unnecessary complications. Emma remained calm. The families we serve deserve programs built on trust. If we overlook mistakes because the outcome seems convenient, we slowly lose the very trust we are trying to earn. Richard studied her expression, searching for uncertainty, but found none. He quietly carried the documents upstairs to Daniel's office. Daniel reviewed every page without speaking. Finally, he looked toward the conference room window overlooking downtown Denver. Weeks earlier, he had watched a woman return $50,000 she desperately needed. Now she had voluntarily reported another financial mistake that almost nobody would ever have discovered. The amount was different. The principle was exactly the same. Correct the records immediately, Daniel said. If the resource fair needs to be rescheduled by a few days, we will explain the reason honestly. Richard hesitated. Most organizations would simply leave the adjustment until after the event. Daniel slowly closed the folder. Emma Carter is teaching us that integrity cannot depend on convenience. News of the accounting correction quietly spread through senior leadership. No one criticized Emma. Instead, department managers began reviewing their own procedures more carefully, realizing that transparency strengthened confidence rather than weakening it. Later that evening, Emma remained in the nearly empty office finishing notes for the revised event schedule. As she gathered her papers, she noticed Daniel walking through the hallway carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stopped beside her desk and placed 1 cup gently within reach. "Long day," he said with an easy smile. Emma accepted the coffee gratefully. "Worth every minute if it helps people." Daniel looked at her for a thoughtful moment before quietly replying, "Some lessons cannot be taught in a boardroom." Emma smiled politely, still unaware that the greatest lesson she had ever given him had begun weeks earlier on a rainy afternoon outside a downtown police station, long before either of them knew the other one's name. Early spring arrived in Denver with longer afternoons and warmer sunlight spilling across the glass walls of Walker Capital, but the greatest change was not the season. It was the atmosphere inside the company itself. Departments that had once measured success almost entirely through numbers had begun asking different questions. How many families had actually been helped? Which neighborhoods still needed support? Emma Carter quietly became the person everyone visited before launching a new community initiative because she never spoke first about budgets or publicity. She spoke about people. One afternoon, Daniel Brooks asked his assistant to invite Emma to his office at the end of the workday. She assumed they would be discussing the upcoming Spring Community Festival and arrived carrying a notebook filled with volunteer schedules and outreach plans. Daniel welcomed her warmly and gestured toward two comfortable chairs beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The golden light reflected across the skyline as traffic slowly filled the streets below. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "There is something I should have told you a long time ago." Emma looked at him with quiet curiosity. Daniel folded his hands together before continuing. "The day you found the leather messenger bag with $50,000, I was parked across the street from the police station. I watched you walk inside. I watched you walk back out with nothing." Emma blinked in surprise. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Daniel continued before she could respond. "I knew exactly how much money was inside because the bag belonged to one of our investment partners." Emma slowly lowered her notebook onto the table. "You were there?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Another silence settled between them. Then Emma asked the question that had quietly waited beneath every coincidence since that rainy afternoon. "Were you the one who followed me home?" Daniel did not search for an excuse. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I asked my driver to keep his distance because I wanted to understand why someone who clearly needed that money would choose to return it." Emma looked down for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "Do you know how unsettling it feels to hear that?" she asked calmly. "A stranger watched my home. My daughter lives there." Daniel's expression immediately filled with regret. "You are right," he said quietly. "I crossed a line. I never approached you, and I never intended to frighten you. But intention does not erase the mistake. I am sincerely sorry." Emma studied his face carefully. She had met many people who apologized only after being confronted. Daniel sounded different. There was no attempt to defend himself or explain away what he had done. Only honesty. After a long pause, she asked, "Why did it matter so much?" Daniel turned toward the city skyline before answering. "Because I have spent most of my career believing every decision has a price and every person has a reason. When you walked away from $50,000, I realized there are some choices that cannot be explained by profit. Then I watched you continue making the same choice every day in smaller ways. Returning extra change, helping strangers, reporting mistakes that nobody else could see. You reminded me that integrity is not one extraordinary moment. It is a habit." Emma smiled gently, her disappointment slowly giving way to understanding. "Integrity only matters when keeping it costs you something," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I know that now because of you." The evening sunlight faded behind the mountains as the conversation ended, not with perfect agreement, but with mutual respect built upon truth instead of assumptions. When Emma stood to leave, Daniel did not offer a reward, a promotion, or a promise. He simply thanked her. As she walked toward the elevator carrying the same notebook she had brought into the office, she realized something important had changed. Months earlier, a billionaire had followed her home searching for the reason behind one honest decision. Now he no longer needed to search because the answer had quietly transformed both of their lives. The Spring Community Festival arrived beneath a brilliant Colorado sky, filled with warm sunshine and the fresh scent of blooming maple trees. Families gathered across the grounds of Cedar Ridge Community Center while children laughed between colorful booths. Local musicians played gentle acoustic songs, volunteers served homemade meals, and neighbors greeted one another like old friends. Months earlier, many of these same families had struggled to find consistent support. Now the community itself had become stronger because people had finally been invited to help shape the solutions instead of simply receiving them. Emma Carter walked through the festival carrying a clipboard that she hardly needed anymore because every volunteer already understood their role. She stopped often to greet elderly residents by name, knelt to speak with children at eye level, and thanked every volunteer as though each small contribution mattered equally. Sophie proudly handed packets of flower seeds to visiting families, while laughing each time Max happily accepted another gentle pat on the head from excited children. Daniel Brooks stood nearby without the distance that had once surrounded his position as chief executive officer. Instead of remaining on the main stage waiting for recognition, he helped volunteers arrange folding chairs, carried supply boxes, and quietly thanked community partners who had worked for months to make the event successful. When the afternoon ceremony finally began, Local leaders invited Daniel to address the crowd. He stepped to the microphone, looked across the hundreds of smiling faces gathered before him, then surprised everyone by speaking only briefly. "Today is not about a company," he said. "It is about a community that reminded us real progress begins by listening before leading." He then invited Emma to join him on the stage. She hesitated for a moment before walking forward, clearly more comfortable standing beside volunteers than speaking before a large audience. Daniel smiled warmly. "Everything you see here exists because someone believed every family deserved to be heard." Emma helped all of us remember that. The audience applauded as Emma accepted the microphone with quiet humility. She looked towards Sophie, standing beside Max, before turning back to the crowd. "People sometimes believe kindness changes the world through one extraordinary moment," she said gently. "I think it changes the world through ordinary choices repeated every single day. Returning something that is not yours. Telling the truth when it is inconvenient. Helping a neighbor even when nobody notices. Those choices may seem small, but together they become the foundation of trust." The applause grew even louder, not because her words were dramatic, but because they felt true to everyone listening. After the ceremony, Daniel walked with Emma toward a small garden beside the community center, where 2 young maple trees waited to be planted. Sophie eagerly helped place fresh soil around the roots while Max sat quietly nearby watching the family with patient contentment. As the final shovelful of earth settled into place, Daniel looked toward Emma with sincere gratitude. "Months ago, I thought I was following someone home because I wanted to understand one remarkable decision," he said softly. "Now I know I was really searching for something I had lost inside myself." Emma smiled peacefully before brushing the soil from her hands. "Sometimes the greatest things we find were never missing," she replied. "We simply stopped noticing them." The golden evening sunlight stretched across the garden as families slowly made their way home carrying flowers, laughter, and new friendships. The 2 young maple trees stood quietly beside the community center, their roots just beginning to take hold beneath the earth. Like every honest choice Emma had ever made, their greatest growth would happen where almost nobody could see it. Daniel watched the trees sway gently in the evening breeze and finally understood a lesson no fortune could ever purchase. Money could build buildings, fund programs, and create opportunities, but character was the only wealth that continued growing after it had been shared. And on one rainy afternoon, when a struggling mother chose integrity over desperation, she had unknowingly given a billionaire the most valuable gift of his entire life.